G'day, and thank you for joining me today on Essays from a Strange Country. I'm your host, writer, and producer, Jasmine Wolfe. Each episode explores Australia through the stories we tell and the culture we create. Through literature, film, art, and music, I'll examine the people, ideas, myths, and contradictions that shape Australia and our understanding of ourselves. So settle in and let's begin. Contemporary Australian Gothic is most revealing when it stops treating terror as an exotic disturbance and recognises it as a condition of habitation. In a settler society, the home is never simply home. It is a legal arrangement, a story of possession, a marketable address, and a denial, rehearsed until it begins to sound like common sense. The Gothic's familiar grammar of haunting, secrecy, and return therefore acquires a local sharpness. What comes back is not merely a buried crime, but the unfinished structure that made ordinary life possible. Dispossession, racial classification, migrant dislocation, gendered looking, and the national appetite for heroic self-description. Contemporary Australian Gothic exposes belonging as an unstable and unevenly distributed fiction. In Michel de Cretz's The Lost Dog, the uncanny emerges through the migrant subject's divided relation to memory and place. Tom Loxley is neither simply exiled nor securely settled, but caught between histories that refuse to remain private. Beth Yarp's The Crocodile Fury and Simone Lazaru's The Australian Fiancé shift Gothic horror from landscape to perception, turning the Orientalist gaze into a site of menace. Their hybrid demonologies make racialized femininity resistant to consumption, returning violence to the visual regimes that have long rendered Asian women desirable and silent. Then we turn to Alexis Wright's Carpentaria, where Gothic force is redirected from Indigenous presence to settler infrastructure. Wright does not make Aboriginal sovereignty spectral. She makes mining, policing, bureaucracy, and property appear as the strange, deathly systems they are. This reversal matters because the Gothic, as a European genre, carries colonial baggage. Used carelessly, it can turn living country and continuing law into atmospheric haunting. Used skeptically, however, it can disclose the absurdity and violence of settler claims to order. Finally, through Shu Ming Teo's Behind the Moon and Ouyang Yu's Billy Sing, the essay considers how Gothic writing dismantles national myths of mateship and Anzac sacrifice. These myths promise intimacy and inclusion while quietly sorting bodies by race, gender, sexuality, and usefulness. The contemporary Australian Gothic does not merely add darker decorations to the national story or rearrange its furniture. Contemporary Australian Gothic begins not with an exotic terror imported from elsewhere, but with a domestic embarrassment. The home is not secure. Freud's unheimlich, usually translated as the uncanny, carries the more literal sense of the unhomely, the condition of not being at home in what ought to be familiar. In Australia, that meaning has particular force. A settler colony cannot easily convert occupation into belonging, however confidently it fences, surveys, names, and sells the ground. The uncanny here is therefore not merely psychological unease. It is a structure of habitation, the nation felt as intimate and illegitimate, ordinary and unresolved. To be in place in this literature is never simply to stand on ground. It is to stand within histories that decide who may belong there. For Aboriginal people, settler colonialism produces a brutal inversion. Those whose relation to country precedes the state are repeatedly made foreign by the state's laws, maps, towns, and institutions. For migrants, the condition is different, though it also carries dislocation. Attachment to Australia is complicated by memory, racialization, and the unfinished business of other homes. Contemporary Gothic is most interesting when it refuses to merge these histories into a bland multicultural atmosphere. It allows them to touch without making them equivalent. Michel de Cretz's The Lost Dog gives this unhomely condition a finely worked fictional form. Tom Loxley, a migrant intellectual from India, inhabits Australia with the outward signs of settlement: work, language, intimacy, cultural competence. Yet the novel persistently unsettles that appearance. Tom's Indian childhood does not sit behind him as a completed chapter. It returns unevenly through fragments, evasions, and atmospheres rather than clear recollection. De Creze is alert to the bad manners of memory. It does not arrive when summoned, and it rarely stays where it is put. The lost dog of the title belongs to this wider pattern of disappearance and return, absence and pressure, the misplaced thing that reorganizes the world around its lack. The novel's Gothic force lies in the way private repression begins to echo national denial. Tom's difficulty in accommodating his past is not a simple allegory for Australia's colonial amnesia, but the parallel is carefully staged. Both personal and national histories depend on habits of mislaying: silence, aesthetic distance, displacement, the hope that what has been buried will behave itself. In De Cretz's Australia, the landscape is not a blank surface on which the migrant subject may reinvent himself. Nor is it the purified open space of tourist and pastoral fantasy. It is dense with histories that have not been welcomed into public memory. This density matters because belonging is often imagined as a reward for duration, affection, or respectability. Tom has lived in Australia. He thinks and works within its institutions. He is not simply outside the national scene, yet the novel shows that residence is a poor substitute for historical accommodation. His Australian present cannot fully absorb his Indian past, just as Australia cannot secure its own sense of home while refusing the colonial violence that made the home available. The result is not exile in the old dramatic sense, but a subtler double condition: being here and elsewhere, placed and displaced, familiar with the room yet unable to trust its foundations. The contemporary uncanny, then, does more than announce that the past haunts the present. That formula is too tidy and too flattering to the present, as though history were an intruder rather than a landlord. In Australian Gothic, the past is not finished matter returning from the grave. It remains active in land, law, race, memory, and social perception. Colonial dispossession, racial exclusion, and migrant displacement are not decorative ghosts. They are living arrangements, reproduced through ordinary spaces and ordinary manners. The houses, suburbs, bushlands, and cities of this writing become uncanny because they are overfull with what has been denied. They disclose with little ceremony the fragility of every claim to being at home. Asian Australian women's Gothic writing shifts the site of horror away from the familiar settler landscape of bush, homestead, and hostile emptiness. The terror is no longer simply out there, waiting in the scrub to unsettle white confidence. It resides instead in the act of looking, in the camera, the fetish, the colonial romance, and the racial script that turns Asian women into decorative bodies rather than speaking subjects. This is the significance of hybridized demonology. By drawing on Asian folklore and Western Gothic conventions, writers such as Beth Yap and Simone Lazaru remake monstrosity as a form of resistance to the Orientalist gaze. Orientalism does not merely misrepresent Asian women, it produces them as objects for Western consumption. The Asian woman is made mysterious, submissive, seductive, dangerous, or some convenient mixture of all four. She is visible as body but obscured as consciousness. Gothic monstrosity interrupts this arrangement because the monster cannot be easily possessed. She is excessive, unstable, hungry, sexual, enraged, spectral. She does not remain politely available to be admired, photographed, rescued, or interpreted. In this sense, the monstrous feminine becomes politically useful. It makes racialized femininity difficult to consume without consequence. Beth Yarp's The Crocodile Fury offers a particularly forceful version of this strategy through the figure of the Pontianak, the female death spirit from Malay folklore. The Pontianak condenses categories that patriarchal and colonial orders prefer to keep separate: femininity, sexuality, maternity, rage, appetite, and death. She is not the pale, mournful ghost of European domestic tragedy, drifting about in symbolic distress. She is active, seductive, and dangerous. Yarp does not present her as exotic ornament, there to lend the text a little folkloric atmosphere. The Pontianak becomes a figure through which racial and gendered violence is answered by supernatural refusal. This is what biting back means in Yarp's Gothic. It is not simply a neat phrase for revenge, it names a reversal of consumption. Colonial and Orientalist fantasies have long consumed Asian women as images: the obedient servant, the sensual native, the tragic beauty, the silent beloved. Yarp turns that appetite inside out. The figure who has been made available to the gaze becomes the figure who attacks it. The Pontianak's monstrosity registers the violence of objectification and answers it in the Gothic's own bodily language: blood, haunting, desire, and fear. Her fury is not irrational, it is historical. Simone Lazarou's The Australian Fiancé examines the same economy of racialized looking through a different Gothic device: the camera. The novel centers on a Eurasian woman whose body is repeatedly framed, photographed, desired, and interpreted through white masculine power. The camera appears to preserve her image, but preservation here is inseparable from possession. It does not simply record, it disciplines. It turns a woman into an object that can be arranged, aestheticized, and kept, while disguising control as admiration or art. Power often prefers a tasteful vocabulary when caught staring. Lazarou's Gothic is therefore less concerned with a single supernatural monster than with a monstrous visual system. The white fiancé's gaze produces the Eurasian woman as beautiful but subordinate, intimate but unknowable, desirable but never fully sovereign. The photograph promises knowledge, yet it fragments the person it claims to reveal. The more she is looked at, the less she is allowed to exist on her own terms. This is the uncanny force of Lazarou's visual Gothic. The image appears stable, but it exposes a deeper instability in the relations between race, gender, and colonial desire. Together, Yarp and Lazarou show that Asian Australian Gothic unsettles the sentimental language of multicultural inclusion. Their work refuses the comforting idea that racial difference has been resolved because it can now be admired, desired, or displayed. Racialization persists not only in hostility, but also in fascination, intimacy, and representation. The Asian woman may be welcomed as spectacle, lover, muse, or symbol, while still being denied subjecthood. Hybridized demonology answers this by making the object of fantasy dangerous. The Pontianak, the spectral woman, the photographed body that will not remain still. These figures disturb the colonial wish to look without being implicated. They return the gaze, and when necessary they bite. Alexis Wright's Carpentaria radically alters the direction of Australian Gothic haunting. In older settler versions of the form, Aboriginal presence often appears as the unsettling force that disturbs white claims to place, a murmur in the bush, a pressure in the landscape, a sign that the continent was never the empty stage settlement required it to be. Wright reverses that arrangement. In Carpentaria, it is not Indigenous presence that is ghostly, irrational, or out of place. It is settler colonialism itself that becomes the invasive and deathly force, the thing that keeps arriving, measuring, naming, mining, policing, and congratulating itself for imposing order on country already dense with law, memory, kinship, and story. This reversal is central to the novel's political force. Wright is not simply inserting Aboriginal material into a European Gothic structure, as though Indigenous sovereignty could be represented by adding ancestral presences to the haunted house tradition. The fictional town of Dispossession sits on Wanyi country, a world shaped by the ancestral serpent, and by continuing relations among people, land, sea, weather, and non-human life. Country is not scenery nor symbolic background, nor a wilderness waiting to be interpreted by the troubled settler mind. It is active, storied, lawful, and alive. Against this, settler institutions appear not as rational order, but as a kind of colonial disorder. Council offices, police files, mining leases, prisons, pipelines, and roads become the instruments through which the state tries to make country legible by damaging it. Wright's Gothic is therefore infrastructural. The horror is not confined to ruins, family secrets, or spectral figures. It is built into the material systems of occupation. The mine in Carpentaria is especially important. It functions almost as a monstrous body, invasive and hungry, cutting into country while presenting itself as economic progress. Its roads and pipelines do not merely move resources, they reorganize space according to extractive desire. They impose a foreign anatomy on land that is already meaningful. The spectral white hands of infrastructure name this diffuse but constant touch of colonial power, the mine called employment, the prison called justice, the council archive called administration, the police operation called order. Wright's achievement is to make these ordinary instruments appear as strange as they are. The white residents of Uptown reveal the anxiety beneath this apparatus. They imagine themselves as the fragile defenders of civilization against Aboriginal chaos, but their fear depends on a deep misreading of history. They are not anxious because Aboriginal people are invading their world. They are anxious because their own claims to place remain unstable. Settler belonging must be performed, documented, and enforced because it cannot finally settle the question of sovereignty. Hence the feverish reliance on property boundaries, official records, town divisions, regulations, and police authority. Bureaucracy becomes a ritual of reassurance. If enough forms are stamped, perhaps the ground will stop remembering. Yet Carpentaria does not offer a simple opposition between pure Indigenous continuity and corrupt settler intrusion. Wright's Aboriginal characters are divided, grieving, compromised, and fiercely alive. The tensions between East Side and West Side, the fractures within the Phantom family, Angel Day's acquisitiveness, Normal Phantom's sorrow, and Will Phantom's resistance all complicate any easy reading of Indigenous community as undamaged wholeness. But this complexity sharpens rather than weakens the novel's critique. Colonial violence does not merely act from outside, it produces internal pressures and then treats those pressures as evidence of Indigenous failure. The trick is familiar enough. The Gothic enables Wright to show settler colonialism not as a completed historical event, but as a continuing structure with pipes, trucks, files, police, corporate managers, and government permissions. Its violence is not only spectacular, though histories of overt brutality remain present. It is also slow, procedural, and spatial. It decides where people may live, how land will be valued, whose knowledge counts, and which bodies may be confined or removed. In this sense, the prison and archive are as Gothic as the graveyard, though considerably better funded. Still, Carpentaria is not a novel of indigenous disappearance. Its energies move towards endurance, resurgence, and sovereign relation to country. The serpent, the sea, cyclonic weather, and the deep temporalities of law exceed the brittle geometries of colonial infrastructure. Settler power may scar country, but it does not author it. The haunting then runs in the opposite direction to the national fantasy. Aboriginal sovereignty is not the ghost, it is the continuing reality. The ghost is the settler dream that mines, councils, police, and paperwork can finally master country by enclosing it. Wright makes that dream look properly deranged. Contemporary Australian Gothic does not simply invent new monsters. It returns to the nation's old heroic figures and asks what had to be buried in order for them to look so clean. Mateship, Anzac sacrifice, the bushman, the digger, and the decent bloke have often been presented as natural expressions of Australian character. They are better understood as selective cultural arrangements. These myths decide who may stand at the centre of national memory, who may be mourned as properly Australian, and who must remain just outside the frame. The Gothic is useful because national mythology already behaves like a ghost story. It repeats, insists, sentimentalizes, and asks to be believed despite contrary evidence. Mateship is perhaps the most durable of these myths. It is commonly celebrated as egalitarian loyalty between men, modest, practical, and anti-authoritarian. Yet its apparent generosity depends on exclusions that are rarely incidental. Its imagined subject has usually been white, masculine, heterosexual, and untroubled by the labour that sustains him. Women, migrants, queer subjects, and Aboriginal sovereignty are pushed to the margins so that male solidarity can appear universal rather than historically narrow. Contemporary Gothic writing turns this myth inside out, showing that what looks like national warmth may also operate as a mechanism of discipline. Xu Ming, Teo's Behind the Moon dismantles mateship by moving attention away from nationalist centre stage and towards suburban lives treated as peripheral. The novel follows Justin Cheong, Tien Ho, and Gibbo, whose friendship forms outside the authorised script of Australian belonging. They are not the bronzed companions of patriotic folklore. They are Asian, queer, feminised, socially awkward, wounded and excessive in ways that disturb the clean lines of masculine national fantasy. Their presence does not simply diversify the myth of mateship, it exposes the conditions under which that myth has been allowed to seem coherent. Teo's suburbia is Gothic not because it contains supernatural apparitions, but because ordinary social spaces become charged with fear, shame, and exclusion. Schools, family homes, streets, and adolescent rituals carry the dull violence of racism, homophobia, and misogyny. The horror is not spectacular, it is habitual. The characters are not expelled from Australia in any dramatic sense. They are pressed against its surfaces, close enough to understand its promises, but denied the ease of inhabiting them. This is the contemporary uncanny in social form. Belonging is everywhere advertised and unevenly distributed. In Behind the Moon, friendship is real, but it does not redeem the national myth. Gibbo's troubled masculinity, Justin's queer desire, and Tien's position as a Vietnamese Australian girl all unsettle the assumption that mateship is a neutral ethic. Their bond develops under pressure from the very categories the nation uses to sort bodies into acceptable and unacceptable forms. Teo's Gothic force lies in this pressure. The characters are haunted less by ghosts than by inherited scripts of race, gender, and sexuality that tell them they are wrongly made for the country they inhabit. Ouyang Yu's Billy Singh turns from suburbia to the Anzac legend, and does so without the usual reverence expected near that shrine. The historical Billy Singh was a celebrated Gallipoli sniper and a soldier of Chinese descent, a fact Australian memory has often found awkward. Ouyang refuses to absorb Singh into Anzac mythology as a convenient multicultural addition, the kind of inclusion that leaves the structure of the myth untouched. Instead, he creates what may be called a death history, a counter-history written through bodily damage, violence, obscenity, and refusal, rather than patriotic consolation. Death history matters because it names a history composed from what nationalism sanitizes. In Billy Singh, the soldier's body becomes the site where race, empire, masculinity, war, and memory collide. Ouyang's abrasive language resists the smooth tones of commemoration. The poem does not allow Singh to become a tidy emblem of Australian courage, nor a reassuring sign that the Anzac tradition was always capacious after all. It shows that inclusion can itself be violent when it welcomes the racialized subject only after he has served imperial war. The Gothic quality of Billy Singh lies in its treatment of national memory as a theatre of the dead. The nation honours sacrifice while arranging the dead into useful shapes. It remembers Singh's marksmanship while neglecting the racial conditions under which a Chinese Australian body could be recognised as Australian through military violence, but not fully admitted into national belonging. Singh becomes both hero and revenant, summoned by the nation yet never comfortably housed within it. Together, Teo and Ouyang show that Australian identity is not a stable inheritance, but a haunted construction, built through selective memory and ritual forgetting. Their work does not merely add missing figures to the national story. It asks what kind of story required their disappearance in the first place. Through death history, the Gothic turns commemoration into disturbance. Mateship and Anzac legend remain powerful, but here they look less like noble foundations than decorated houses with serious structural damage. The Gothic is a useful critical language in Australia, but it is not an innocent one. It arrives as a European genre, carrying the furniture of its origins: castles, inheritances, family curses, buried crimes, ancestral guilt, and the return of what respectable society has attempted to conceal. In a settler colony, this baggage matters. The culture that produced the Gothic also produced maps, fences, racial classifications, legal fictions, and imperial habits of possession. To use the Gothic uncritically when reading Aboriginal writing risks turning Indigenous experience into another dimly lit chamber in the colonial house. It may look atmospheric, it may also be doing the old work in a more literary coat. The problem is especially sharp around haunting. In Western Gothic traditions, ghosts often emerge from a repressed past. Something violent or shameful has occurred. It has been denied. It returns to trouble the present. This model can be powerful for analysing settler Australia, whose public culture has often preferred commemoration to memory and reconciliation rhetoric to structural change. Yet the same model can become distorting when applied too casually to Aboriginal presence. If Indigenous people are read primarily as ghosts, they risk being made spectral in precisely the way settler culture has long found convenient, present enough to trouble national confidence, but not present enough to require land, law, or sovereignty to be taken seriously. This is not merely a question of terminology. The Gothic tends to organize time around rupture and return. The past breaks into the present because it has not been properly acknowledged. The underlying fantasy, even in dark form, is often one of revelation and possible restoration. The secret is exposed, the ghost is recognized, the house may be cleansed. That narrative structure sits uneasily with Aboriginal cosmologies in which ancestral presence is not a pathological residue of the past, but an ongoing relation. Country is not a haunted backdrop. It is living, lawful, storied, and active. Ancestors are not simply revenants awaiting recognition by modernity. They belong to continuing systems of obligation, place, kinship, and time that do not fit neatly into Western divisions between then and now. For this reason, the Gothic works best in Indigenous contexts when it is turned back upon settler colonialism rather than imposed upon Aboriginal being. The truly Gothic object in contemporary Australia is not Indigenous spirituality, but the settler state's anxious insistence that its legitimacy is settled. The horror lies in the archive that misnames, the map that erases, the mind that eats country, the prison that extends invasion by administrative means, and the heritage plaque that performs acknowledgement while leaving possession intact. These are not decorative metaphors. They are material structures through which colonial power continues to reproduce itself while speaking with admirable composure in the language of order. Alexis Wright's Carpentaria is crucial because it does not simply adopt the Gothic as a ready-made European form. It stretches and unsettles it. The novel contains uncanny landscapes, violent intensities, ghostly pressures, and apocalyptic weather. But these elements do not submit to the familiar Gothic logic of repression, confession, and closure. Wright's world is organized through living country, competing laws, ancestral power, ecological time, capitalist intrusion, and Indigenous endurance. The Gothic is present, but it is not sovereign. If anything, Carpentaria makes settler modernity look like the superstitious system, fearful of Aboriginal authority, obsessed with extraction, and strangely convinced that infrastructure might solve the metaphysical problem of theft. The necessary position, then, is neither to reject the Gothic outright nor to celebrate it too quickly. It remains valuable for diagnosing white Australia's condition, its bad conscience, its historical evasions, its need to convert dispossession into property and property into innocence. The Gothic gives critics a language for uncanny unsettlement and for the return of colonial violence in contemporary forms. But the genre must be kept in its place. Aboriginal writers do not need the Gothic to make country meaningful, ancestors present, or history alive. When their work appears Gothic, it is often because settler colonialism itself is Gothic, invasive, repetitive, deathly and absurdly confident in its own rationality. Handled with suspicion, the Gothic can reveal the haunted architecture of the settler nation. Handled carelessly, it can reduce Aboriginal sovereignty to a ghost story. The distinction matters. Indigenous writing may use Gothic effects, but it also exceeds them, moving beyond haunting towards presence, law, relation, and futurity. The issue was never simply a restless past. It was and remains unfinished sovereignty. Contemporary Australian Gothic, as these works suggest, is not a decorative literature of shadows, but a method for reading the nation's ordinary arrangements under pressure. Its houses, suburbs, photographs, mines, archives, and memorial rituals become uncanny because they are the places where belonging is manufactured and found wanting. The genre's power lies in its capacity to make familiar national forms appear strange: the home as occupation, the gaze as possession, infrastructure as invasion, mateship as exclusion, commemoration as a disciplined management of the dead. Yet the Gothic matters most when it refuses easy equivalence. Migrant dislocation, racialized femininity, and indigenous dispossession intersect, but they do not collapse into a single experience of not belonging. De Kretz's unhomely migrant subject, Yap and Lazarou's women who return or rupture the Orientalist gaze, Teo's suburban misfits, Ouyang's abrasive counter-memory, and Wright's sovereign country all expose different failures in Australia's self-description. What joins them is not a shared wound neatly available for national therapy, but a shared disturbance of the stories through which the nation makes itself comfortable. This disturbance is especially sharp because Australian public culture has often mistaken acknowledgement for transformation. It prefers ghosts that can be named, mourned, and filed away. Contemporary Gothic is less obliging. It shows that the past is not simply returning. It is built into property, race, gender, law, labour, desire, and landscape. The nation is not haunted because it has forgotten. It is haunted because forgetting has been made useful. The qualification is crucial. The Gothic can illuminate settler Australia's evasions, but it must not be allowed to convert Aboriginal sovereignty into spectral atmosphere. Wright's Carpentaria demonstrates the more rigorous possibility. The Gothic turned back on colonial modernity, while country, law, and Indigenous futurity exceed its terms. The final implication is therefore not that Australia is a haunted house awaiting confession and repair. That would be too tidy and too flattering. Rather, contemporary Australian Gothic reveals a home built on unsettled ground, crowded with those it has tried to misrecognise, and still unable to decide whether it wants truth, innocence, or merely better lighting for now. That's all for this episode of Essays from a Strange Country. I'm Jasmine Wolfe, and you've been listening to a small attempt to make sense of Australian identity through the things we create when we're not busy avoiding the question entirely. Film, literature, art and music give us more than cultural decoration. They give us evidence. If today's episode has left you with a firmer answer about what Australia is, I'm afraid something has gone wrong. The point is not to solve the country. The point is to notice how often it contradicts itself and how revealing those contradictions can be. If you enjoyed the episode, subscribe, share it, or mention it vaguely to someone at a barbecue before the conversation collapses into real estate. Until next time, keep reading the margins, watching the background, and listening for what the culture tries not to say.